We begin today's shiur at the top line of Daf Lamed Aleph. Before we begin the actual text, we glance at the side where we have our nosei, our topic heading, which reads, Gemara Tasbir, Loma Dino Shel Rav Chisda Shel Hagonev Chelbo Shel Chavero V'Yochlo Chayav B'Tashlumin. The Gemara will explain why the law presented by Rav Chisda that one who steals the chelev, forbidden fats, that belong to his friend, and then eats it, he's chayav to pay. Eino pligo adino shel Rabbi Oven, that it is not at odds with Rabbi Oven's halacha, which deals with hazorek chetz. A person shoots an arrow that travels 4 amos on Shabbos, and in the course of its flight, it tears garments or materials, fabrics belonging to someone else. Shu potter. So that you have a seeming conflict, which the Gemara has to show is in fact not a conflict, between Rav Chisda's din of someone picking up chelev belonging to someone else and eating it, where he not only will be chayav the punishment of kores, but also be chayav to pay for it, whereas in the case of the shot arrow that tears someone's garments, he will not be chayav on the financial level. The Gemara, top line, Gufa, Omar Rav Chisda, Moide Rabbi Yehonasan Berger. This is a point that we saw in our previous year, that Rav Chisda tells us that the Tana, Rabbi Yehonasan Berger, whose Shlita, whose opinion is that one who incurs financial responsibility, obligation, while at the same time violating an offense, a sin that warrants the kores punishment, one is thereby exempt from the financial aspect. Yet he conceives one who steals the chelev, forbidden fats, of his friend and then eats it, shu chayav, he'll be obligated to pay, in addition to the fact that for eating it he'll be chayav kores. Why here is he yes chayav on the financial end of things? Shekvar nischayav begeneva koydem shavo lidei isur chelev. Since the two offenses were not simultaneous, therefore the monetary aspect set in at the point he picked up the chelev. That's the act of theft. And at that point he becomes financially obligated, not yet chayav for kores, because he hasn't eaten it at that moment. Therefore, he's chayav for the geneva, which set in before the kores offense of eating the chelev. So that when things are simultaneous, the financial and the life-threatening punishment, when they're simultaneous, so then there's exemption. When they're not simultaneous, when the financial obligation sets in first, it's treated separately, and hence he's not exempted from it. The Gemara now asks a question, lasting a few lines. Lema pliga de Rabbi Oven. Should we say that what Rav Chisda is telling us is at odds, differs, argues with Rabbi Oven? The Omer Rabbi Oven, Hazorek Chetz Mitchilas Arba L'Soif Arba. This is a Shabbos-related offense, one who shoots an arrow that travels a distance of minimum of 4 amos. The Korah Shiroin Ba'lochaso, and it tears Shiroin fabrics belonging to his friend in its flight. Potur, he is exempt from Tashlumin, from the financial aspect for the need of remuneration. She'akira tzorech hanochahi. The exemption is because when the arrow was picked up, the akira is when it's picked up and then shot, it's in anticipation of the eventual landing of it. The malacha, we didn't explain this before, but the malacha of Shabbos, the prohibited activity of Shabbos that is referred to here, is the transportation of an item of more than 4 amos in a public thoroughfare. So this arrow that was shot in the public thoroughfare the malacha involves, this idea of transporting something involves its picking up, its dislocation from its point of origin, and its eventual relocation, its landing at its destination. So when the arrow was picked up, that was the beginning of the malacha. In the course of this malacha, the forbidden activity of moving something 4 amos in a public thoroughfare, in the course of it, in the midst of it, a financial obligation was incurred through the tearing of the shiur of the fabric. And since the tearing took place in the midst of the Shabbos offense, there is exemption. Now, with that analysis in mind, we continue our question and say, Hachanami, so too here with the achilas chelev, with the theft of the chelev. Hagbo tzorach achilahi. The initial picking up of the chelev was in anticipation of the eventual eating of it. The parallel here to the case of Hagbo and the hanocha of the arrow, here of the Hagbo, the picking up of the chelev, which was at the beginning. That is in anticipation. That will say, why don't we say that at that point already that you picked up the chelev with the anticipation of eating it, that was like the beginning of the act of eating. So that at that time you're also incurring a financial responsibility for taking someone else's chelev. But there should be exemption, just like Rabbi Oven featured exemption in the case of Zorek Chetz. The Gemara says there is no comparison. Hochi hashta. How can you compare the case of Zorek Chetz to the case of the Achilas Chelev? Hasam, and the Gemara will continue now with 2 distinctions, and that's why you see numbering 1 and a couple lines later at number 2. Hasam, in the case of Shabbos, ef shulanocha blo akira, the closing of that malacha, the end of that malacha is unfeasible, is impossible to achieve without the beginning. In other words, you can't have a hanocha unless there was an akira. The landing of it presupposes, or built into the hanocha, is an original akira. So it's one inseparable unit of activity, the picking up, which leads to the eventual landing. Hacha, with regard to eating chelev, the eating of chelev carries with it a type of death penalty. It's kores at the hand. It's death in the death through a heavenly intervention. The eating of the chelev, efsher la'achila below hagbo. The eventual eating of it can take place even without the initial picking up of it. The iboi gochin v'ochil. If he should so desire, he could gochin is bend over and eat it that way without having picked it up at all. And without the picking up of it, there's no. We're assuming right now there would be no act of theft. The Rashi says the boy gochin lamato mishloshet tfachim. He could bend down within 3 tfachim, which means there's no actual picking up. The ochil and eat it. Ubotsu migimel lav hagboy, and with less than 3 tfachim raised off the ground, it's not considered hagbo. So you don't have that. You don't have an initial act of stealing in that sense. So when the hagbo is done, it's not an integral part of the eating, since the eating could have been achieved without the hagbo. Therefore, when you do pick it up, that's a separate act, and therefore there is financial obligation incurred at that point for which one is obligated to compensate. Inami, another distinction. Hasam, in the case of Shabbos and the shot arrow, iboi ladura lo motzi mahadilo. If he wants to retract the arrow after it's shot, he can't do that. It's an act once begun that can't be undone. So that from the very beginning, once it's done, once you shoot the arrow, it's considered as if it's completely done. And in the course of that, okay, so there was some financial obligation that was incurred, but you're not going to be chayav for it because it's contained within it's already contained within the act that took place at the very beginning. Hacha, in the case of the chelev, after you pick it up, motzi mahader law, you can restore it, you can put it back down. In other words, the inevitability of it being eaten is not so. In the case of the shot arrow, it's inevitable that the fabric is going to be torn. You can't retract it after it's in flight. And in its flight path was the fabric that is going to be torn. So at the very beginning, it's considered as if the fabric was torn at the very same time that the Shabbos violation set into motion. Not so over here with the chelev. My iko bein hai lishno lahai lishno. What's the difference between explanation number 1 and explanation number 2? Iko binayu, a point of difference would be the following case. Someone picks up a knife in a public thoroughfare and walks with it for 4 amos while holding the knife, and he's holding the knife in such a way that as he's walking along it rips some fabric that's suspended in his path. So this takes place on Shabbos. Is he obligated to pay? According to the first approach that said you can't have the completion of the Shabbos violation, which is called hanocha, the placing down of the item, without the initial picking up of the item. And the financial obligation happened to be sandwiched in between that, and therefore he was exempt. Hachanami, so too in this case, you can't have a person held guilty for putting something down unless that person initially picked it up. And that applies here too as well in the case of Mavir Sakim Shesarabim. Lahach Lishno de Amris Lomotzi Mahadir law, according to the second approach that said that the reason for the shot arrow and the exemption from paying is because at the very beginning when you shot the arrow it was an act that could not be retracted. So the inability to retract it made it such as if the fabric was considered torn right at the outset. But according to this version, the Amris lo motzi mahader, hocha motzi mahader law. In the case of Mavir Sakin, when you picked up the knife and started walking with it, you could have retraced your steps and not have come to tearing the item to begin with. And as a result of this ability to retract, when the financial obligation is incurred, according to this lashon, there would be a separate obligation to compensate for the torn shiroyan. Kufa Omar Rabbi Oven. On the side, we should note the topic heading. Hagmor Makshal Dinos Rabbi Oven. The Gemara will ask on Rabbi Oven's halacha that said Hazoreg Chetz, one who shoots an arrow 4 amos and it tears some shiroyan. So according to Rabbi Oven, he will be exempt. So we read the din of Rabbi Oven that said Hazoreg Chetz Potter She'akira L'Tzorach Hanocha. The picking up was in anticipation of the hanocha at the end. So that din is going to be brought into question, mehamokar shal hageinim kis b'Shabbos chayav, from the case of someone who steals a pouch containing, we'll say, money on Shabbos, he is actually guilty. Gufa, Omar Rabbi Oven, hazorek chetz mitchilas arba l'soif arba. We saw, of course, Rabbi Oven, from the beginning of today's shiur, one who shot an arrow from the beginning of the 4 amma mark, and it traveled a minimum of 4 ammas, and in the course of its flight, it tore someone else's fabrics. So, Potter, he is exempt from paying for the Kriyas HaShiroyin in the course of its halicha, of its travel. She Akira Tzorech Hanocha Hi. The initial picking up was in anticipation of its eventual landing, and in the middle, someone else's fabrics were torn. We have a structural note that draws our attention to a structure that lasts till Omid Beis. The bow tie shape, and you can see on the side under the Mivneh heading, Kushios ushaelos shedarkon novim pirusho shalamoker dagoinev kis. We're going to see questions and explanations through which we'll understand the source that we're about to see in the Gemara regarding one who steals a pouch on Shabbos. Number one, how was the removal from the domain of the owner? Number two, be'eza goydel kis. What size pouch are we dealing with? B'megarer b'seifa. When the source features the dragging out of a pouch, we're going to be interested in knowing what size is that pouch that the source has to talk about it being dragged out. Number three, la'an hotzio. Unto where was it taken? And number four, keman, kemi kotoni mokerze, who is the author of this source. So now let's turn to the Gemara. Mosiv Rav Bevai bar Abai. Rav Bevai raises this source as a question on Rabbi Oven's halacha of Zorek Chetz. And note the question lasts a number of lines. Hagonev kis b'Shabbos chayav. One who steals a wallet, a pouch on Shabbos is guilty of paying for it. Shikvar nischayev b'gneva kodim shiavo lidei isur skila. It's true that when he's in the course of this theft, there's going to be a Shabbos violation, but he becomes chayav on a financial level for the theft before the Shabbos violation takes place, which is referred to in this source as an isur skila, a sin that is punishable by stoning. And we don't have to keep you in suspense. We're talking about the isur of hotzah, of taking something from one domain to another, which is prohibited on Shabbos and punishable by stoning. Nevertheless, in stealing this item, he is first guilty of the financial sin of thievery, of theft, and only later is he in violation of Shabbos. Hoya megar v'yotze, person is dragging out a sack, a pouch, and eventually he steals it. He's dragging it out of the domain of the owner. Potter, he's exempt from the payment, from the need to compensate for the theft. Sharei isur Shabbos ugneva boyin kechad, because the act of Shabbos being violated and the theft happen simultaneously. Now we turn to the beginning of this source and we ask, Ve'amai, why in the beginning is there a chiyuv tashlumin? If Rabbi Oven's analysis is correct, hochanami, here too, lema, why not say like Rabbi Oven, hagbo tzorach hoitzahi, the picking up of the pouch on Shabbos with the intent of theft, is that picking up not in fact the first act that's necessary in creating hotzah, in violating hotzah, the transfer of the item from one domain to another? So from the very beginning he was involved with a Shabbos violation. So what? He stole it in the interim. Why? In the Reisha, if Rabbi Oven is correct, why should he be chayiv to pay for the pouch that he stole? The Gemara answers, Hocha b'mai askinon, in the Reisha that we said he's chayiv to pay, even though there is a death penalty involved. Kagon shigbio al menas lahatsnio. The initial picking up was with the intention of not carrying out. It was the intention of hiding it, putting it away in the house. V'nimlach olav hotzio. And after he had picked it up, he changed his mind and only then carried it out after he changed his mind. So you can't say that the initial picking up was with a Shabbos violation intent as well. So it was a separate act of thievery. The Gemara continues with a specific structure. There's a give and take structure, and on the side you see the house shape featured. With the point facing up, kushios, they represent questions. The inverted house, shuvos, answers. We have a he'ara, a note. Ma'akav ze hu al birur harishon. This give and take is on the first stage of clarification. Havonas haresha. We're trying to understand the beginning of this source. Ech nasta otzah begoinev hakiz kedei shenucha lomar. How was this carried out on Shabbos that we can still say chayav b'tashlumin shekvar nischayav begineva kodim sheyava lidei isur skila? How is it that we can actually say that he was chayav for the gineva before the Shabbos violation set in? So the Gemara tries to explain by saying his original picking up was not with a Shabbos violation intent. In the course of his carrying it around, he changed his mind and then carried it out on Shabbos. The Gemara asks on the second to last narrow line of Gemara, V'chi hai gavno, and in this fashion, mi chayav, would that result in a Shabbos violation at all? Now, don't forget, in the Reisha, there was reference to a Shabbos violation. Just the claim was, it was after the financial obligation set in for the thievery. Ve'omar Rav Simon, Omar Rabbi Ami, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Hamefane chafotzim zovis lezovis, a person who is moving items from one corner of his house to another. The house represents a singular domain. V'nimlach alehem v'hotzion potter. And after he's in the course of moving, let us say, a chair from one corner of his house to the other, he changes his mind, and it's in mid-flight, so to speak, in mid-walking, he walks outdoors. That represents a transfer from private domain to public domain, but yet he is exempt. When he picked up that chair, his original intention was to carry it to a different corner of the room. In the course of his carrying of it, he carries it outside. That does not constitute a Shabbos violation, because the original picking up, which is the start of the melacha, was without a Shabbos violation in mind. It was with the intent of carrying it to another corner of the room. So to explain the Reisha of Gonev Kis, where there was a change of mind in mid-action, that would not explain the Reisha which speaks about a person, yes, violating Shabbos. Lo Tamo. So the Gemara answers, Lo Tamo almanas lahatznio. In the Reisha, don't say that he had picked it up, the item with the intention of hiding it. In the Reisha, the thief picked it up with the intention of hiding it without taking it out. Don't say it like that. Elo'emo almanas lahotzio. He picked it up with the intention of carrying it out. Now, you'll ask then, is that not a hagbah, a picking up torah hotzah for the purpose of carrying it out? Hocha b'mayaskinon kisha'omad. He stood still, and with that, he is therefore chayav for the payment of money. There's a Rashi we would like to take a look at. Hocha b'mayaskinon kisha'omad. Rashi toward the end of the column of Rashi commentary. V'amidaso hi hanocha la'akira rishona. His standing still is considered the placing down of the first picking up. There was the picking up, and then he stood still. That's like standing. That's like putting it down. The Shabbos violation does not take place, therefore, with the first picking up. The Shabbos violation will set in when he starts walking again with the intention of taking it out. V'akiras gufo k'akiras chayfetz, and the picking up, or the start of movement of his body, is like the picking up of the chayfetz from the ground. So now, we turn back to the Gemara. Omad lemai, when you say that after he picked it up, and he had picked it up with the intention of taking it out, but he stood still. Why did he stand still? If he stood still just to adjust the package on his back, urchehu, that's a normal act of carrying, and therefore he should be, when he continues walking, we would say it's not as if he stopped at all. And therefore the original picking up would be a picking up with Shabbos violation in mind, and therefore he should be chayiv only for the Shabbos violation and not for the theft. Elo ba'oimed lofush. Rather, what happened is he picked it up originally with the intention of walking out with it, but he didn't. He picked it up and stopped lofush, to rest. So with that, the act of gineva is done, because he stopped while he was still in the house. He then starts walking again, carrying it out. That's the Shabbos violation, which is, in the Reisha, a separate act, and therefore he's chayav first for the Geneva, and then for the Shabbos violation. Now we ask a question. If that's true, that Omeid Lofush is an explanation for the Chiyuv Shabbos, for the Chiyuv of Geneva, Avol Lekasef Mai, but if he would have stood still just for adjusting the package, then what are you going to say? Potter, we're at the top of Omid Beis now. You say he's exempt from paying. Aditoni, instead of teaching in the Seifa Hoya Megar v'yoytze Potter, the Seifa featured a case of payment exemption. And in order to do that, it had to change the action. Rather, he was dragging it out, and in that way, he ended up being exempt from paying. Nifloig v'nisni b'didah. We should have stayed within the case of say, picking it up and standing still, and made the distinction as follows. Niflog v'usibidah means make a distinction within the same case of picking up without coming to a case of dragging out. And it should have read as follows: Bamed vor mamurim. When is there a chiyuv tashlumin? B'yoymeid lofush, where he stands still to rest. Aval kasef, if he stood still simply to adjust the package, potter, he would be exempt from paying, because that was one continuous act of hotzah alone. Even though physically speaking he stood still, but nevertheless it was a standing still just to adjust the package. That's part of the act of carrying out, and hence it's only an act of Shabbos. Now, but the source didn't read like that. Ella, new approach to explain the Reisha. Ha moni ben azai he. The case of gonev kis is taught in accordance with the Tanaic opinion of Ben Azai, the Omar, Mehalech Ka'oimeid Domi. One who walks, as opposed to one who throws something from one domain to another, one who walks, every step, it's as if he stops at each step. Rashi says, Mehalech Ka'oimeid Domi, V'akiras Kol Psia, the next step you take, every next step you take, Havya Akira V'hanochas haregel, havi akira, v'hanochas haregel, and the placing down of the foot, he hanocha. That's considered the placing down. Hilkoch, kanyo mishas hagba. The thief is said to acquire it from the very initial picking up. V'chiyuv misa b'psia basraisa, and the final step is that which creates the chiyuv Shabbos. Again, let's read that. It's with his last step that the Shabbos chiyuv sets in, so that the Reisha is understood in accordance with Ben Azai. The first picking up is the act of Geneva, and then it's true he kept walking, but the next step is already, the Geneva is already finished, so to speak, by his first act where he picked it up, put it down, and the Chiyuv Misa, that takes place later on with his last step as he steps out of the house. So the two are not happening, the Shabbos and the theft are not happening simultaneously. The Gemara continues. Avol, Zorek Mai, let's say you picked it up and threw it from within the house to outside. Potter. Since we're learning according to Ben Azai, even though Ben Azai says that Mahalech Ka'omed, he wouldn't say the same thing by Zorek. And therefore, if the thief picked up the pouch in the house and threw it outside, the act of original picking up is in anticipation of it landing outside through the zrika, through the throwing. And as far as the theft is concerned, that's taking place at the same time. So if it would be Zorek, he would be exempt. If that's the case, Niflog v'nisni b'didah. The source didn't have to come onto the case of dragging. Could have stayed within the same realm of picking up and read as follows: Bamed v'mamurim. When will there be a chiyuv tashlum, an obligation to pay? B'mahalech. That's while after picking it up, he walks out with the pouch. Avol zorek potter. But there would have been exemption from paying had he thrown the pouch outside. But the source didn't read like that. Why not? The Gemara says, in truth, it could have read like that, but megarer v'yotze, it's the richale. The source had an agenda. It wanted to teach the case of dragging out. I might have thought, without teaching this, that's not the way of Hotzah at all. And there would never be a Chiyuv Shabbos for a person dragging a pouch from indoors to outdoors, from a private home to a street, to a public thoroughfare. Now, I might have thought, since it's an unusual way of executing transportation of an item, therefore things done in an unusual fashion, as a general rule, do not result in a Shabbos violation. Kamash Malon, the source tells us that it falls within the realm of the usual. The Gemara asks, now that you mentioned that, regarding this dragging out issue, uvemai, what type of pouch are you dealing with in the Seifa? If you're talking about a large pouch, that's normal. It's a large sack. It's normal to drag it out, and I don't need a source to tell me something that's obvious. And yet you told me that the source felt compelled to teach me about dragging out. Why? If it's a large pouch, there's no point in telling me the obvious. Ibezutri, if it's a small wallet, lav urchehu, it's actually unusual. It's an unusual act, and you would not be chayav for Shabbos at all. And in the Seifa, you are chayav for the Shabbos violation. Elo b'mitzri. The source is talking about a middle-sized pouch that people at times do drag out. Ude'afke lehecha. We said you took it out of the house. Where did you take it to? What was the final destination? On the side, under the topic heading, we've written, Ha'im shayech liknois b'rshus harabim. Is acquisition possible in a public domain? And when we speak about acquisition, there's legitimate acquisition. There's also acquisition in the context of theft. If the thief doesn't acquire it, so then the act of thievery didn't take place. So we have to analyze the action of taking the article, the pouch from the owner's house outside. Well, where was this outside? How do we describe it? Ude'afke lehechan. He took it out to where? Ide'afke l'rishus harabim. If he took it from the house into a public thoroughfare, isur Shabbos ika, isur geneva leka. When he's dragging it out from a private domain into a public thoroughfare, it's true there's a Shabbos violation, but there's no act of acquisition of Geneva, because the act of drawing something alone does not work when you're drawing it as an act of ownership in a public domain. If he carried it out to a private domain, from a house into an enclosed courtyard, let's say, Isur Geneva Ika, there would be an Isur Geneva, Isur Shabbos Leka, but there's no Shabbos violation. There is an act of theft of having taken it out of the owner's house to another private domain, and you do acquire things in a private domain, but a Shabbos violation does not take place. Lo Tzricha, the case of Megara V'Yotze, is as follows, and we see a diamond that's introduced on the side under the Mivneh heading Shnei Deos Be'im Koinim B'Reshus HaRabim. We're going to see two approaches regarding acquisition in a public domain. So the Gemara continues. The source of dragging out on Shabbos Da'afke L'Tzidei Reshus HaRabim. He dragged it out to an area called Tzidei Reshus HaRabim. This is the area in a public thoroughfare that runs alongside the houses that are built along the street. Rashi adds a little bit more description to this. Tzidei Reshus HaRabim, Samuch Lebatim, next to the houses, Shenoistim Lahalim Min Abotim Avonim U'Michsholim Laharchik Chikucha Agolos. People set up boundaries and blockades in the public thoroughfare to keep carts from banging into the houses themselves. From these blockades or curbs, if you will, this keeps people and their carts away from rubbing into the houses. So that area between the houses and the blockades that line the public domain, that's called Tzidei Reshus HaRabim. We continue with our questions. Ukeman, in accordance with whom are we explaining the source? If the source is understood in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, that says that the Tzidei Reshus HaRabim are classified as Reshus HaRabim, well then Isur Shabbos Ika, Isur Geneva Leka. There is an Isur Shabbos for taking it out from the house into what's called a public domain, but he never picked it up, so there was never an act of thievery. But you'll say, but he dragged it from the house to a public domain. But dragging something without picking it up into a public domain is not a form of acquisition, so there's no theft that took place. If the source is authored by the Rabbanan, the Amri Tzidei Reshus HaRabim Lav Ki Reshus HaRabim Damu, if in accordance with Rabbanan that say that the sides of the Reshus HaRabim are not considered the actual Reshus HaRabim, Isur Geneva Ika, then you do have a theft violation because you took it into something that's not a public thoroughfare, so there is acquisition possible. Isur Shabbos Leka, but there is no Shabbos violation. You didn't take it from a private to a public domain. Now you'll notice that we have a number 1 that's encircled and the word Le'olam is squiggle underlined. A few lines later you see Rav Ashi number 2 and he's squiggle lined, and on the side we have this noted as Deos HaMesumanos with 1 and 2 Soivrim Delo Koinim B'Reshus HaRabim. These two opinions agree that acquisition does not take place in an actual thoroughfare. So the Gemara continues. La'olam Rabbi Eliezer, the source of dragging the pouch out on Shabbos is in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer. When he classified the sides of the Reshus HaRabim of having the status of Reshus HaRabim, Hani Mili Le'inyan Chiyuva de Shabbos. That is so with regard to Shabbos matters. The Zimnin, the Dachki Rabbi V'ayli Lahasam. Why does he classify it as a public domain? Because when it gets crowded in the main thoroughfare, the crowds spill over into the area called Tzidei Reshus HaRabim as well. So as far as Shabbos laws are concerned, it has the status of a Reshus HaRabim. Avol Inyan Mikne Koni. But as far as acquisition is concerned, it's viewed as a non-public thoroughfare. My time. Why? It's not a place that the public is accustomed to being. It's only when there's overflow crowds do they spill over beyond the blockades close to the houses. So, with regard to Shabbos, it has to be a place. In order to be called Rishus Harabim, it's enough that sometimes the public is there. But as far as acquisition purposes, it's not called a Rishus Harabim unless the public is usually there. And see, the Rishus Harabim, they're not usually there. Therefore, acquisition is possible. So what you see in the case of dragging out to the Tzidei Rishus Harabim, the Shabbos violation does take place at the same time that the acquisition takes place, and that's why he is exempt in the case of Megarer V'Yotzei, the Seifa of the original source. Rav Ashi Omar, the case of Megarer V'Yotzei that we said is Potter, he's dragging it out into an actual public domain. You'll ask, well, how does acquisition take place in order for us to say that he's exempt for the thievery? In other words, thievery takes place, but he is exempt for it. Now, you can see that we have an inverted crown shape. On the side, under the Mivneh heading, there's a recommendation to look at the Rashi, Dibur HaMaschil, Rav Acha. Lower on the page, Rav Acha Masni Hachi Kidamoran, the Meshicha Birshus Harabim Lo Kani. Okim Lo Kishitzir Fyodo V'Kiblo L'Soicha. So, that's what Rav Ashi says over here. Let's continue back in our Gemara. Rav Ashi says he drags it out into the actual public domain. Kagon Shitziref Yodo Lamato Mishloisha V'Kiblo. He drags it out from the house and he lowers his hand. Tziref literally means he attaches his hand. Means here in this case he lowers his hand very close to the floor of the public domain, within 3 handbreadths of the floor. V'Kiblo, and the pouch drops into his hand that's close to the floor of the actual public domain. Kidarava, and this works as a means of acquisition based on Rava, the Omar Rava, Yodoi Shel Adam Chashuvalo Ka'arba'o al Arba'o. A person's hand has, even though it doesn't measure 4 by 4 handbreadths, it has the significance of such a location that measures 4 by 4 handbreadths, and hence it's a location in which acquisition can take place. We take a look at Rashi, Kidarava, the Omar Rava. Rashi that we're looking at is a couple lines down from here in the Rashi commentary. The Inyan Hanochas Shabbos Kemokim Arba al Arba. As far as Hanocha for Shabbos purposes, a hand is like an area measuring 4 by 4 tfachim. And just like regarding Shabbos, it's considered a place of significance. As far as acquisition, it's considered as if it's a place of acquisition. It's tantamount to a person picking something up more than 3 tfachim from the ground. That also would constitute an act of acquisition. But remember, in the Seifa, we're talking about a person who never picked it up. He's dragging it out. In this case, he never picked it up in the private domain. In order for him to be considered a thief before the Shabbos violation set in. In this case, the arrival of the pouch in the public domain and the act of acquisition take place at the same time. The reason Rav Ashi mentions Siref is so as to avoid any semblance of having picked it up in the private domain, as the source itself taught. He dragged it out, never picked it up. So with this action of bending over and having one hand in the within 3 tvachim of the ground of the public domain, it's considered a place of significance in terms of landing for Shabbos violation and for acquisition purposes, and you can see they happen simultaneously. Continuing in the Gemara, Rav Acha Masni Hachi. Rav Acha teaches like we just taught, that he dragged it, that meshicha into a public domain is not koneh, and therefore we have to add this element of his hand was lowered near the floor into which the pouch dropped. Ravina Masni, Ravina teaches as follows regarding the issue of unto where did he take it. Li'olam di'afke l'rishus harabim u'b'rishus harabim nami kona. Ravina has a different take on this and says that you do acquire when you drag something into a public domain. And there's a long point that begins in the Gemara now. Utravayu, Ravacho, and Ravina, these two who are arguing regarding acquisition through dragging something directly into a public domain. B'diyuka dahomas nisin komifli. They argue concerning an inference from the following Tanaic source. Disnan. This source deals with someone stealing an animal. A person is stealing an animal. He's dragging it out from the owner's domain. Umeis b'rshus bailim. The animal dies while still in the domain of the owner. Potter. The thief is exempt from paying because it died while still in the owner's domain. Higbio. If the thief picked it up. O shehotzio mirshus bailim umeis, or he dragged it out of the owner's domain and it died afterwards outside. Chayav, then the thief is obligated to compensate. Ravina diek mi reisha, Rav Acha diek mi seifa. Ravina inferred from the reisha and Rav Acha from the seifa, as the Gemara explained. Ravina diek mi reisha. Ravina, who said what he did before, inferred his din from the reisha. And what did the reisha say? The first part of the source read as follows: Hoya moishchay v'yotzei. He was dragging the animal out from its place, from the owner's domain. Umeis b'rshus bailim, and it died in the domain of the owner. Potter. The thief is exempt. Taimo debeis b'rshus bailim. The reason he is exempted because the animal died while the animal was still in the domain of the owner. There was no act of thievery. Ha hotzio mirshus bailim umeis chayav. Had he taken it out of the domain of the owner, wherever he took it out to, even into a public thoroughfare, and then the animal died, he would be chayav. So you see that the act of dragging something out without picking it up is a means of acquisition even in a public domain. That's Ravina's point. Now Rav Acha diek miseifa. Higbio o shehotzio. The Seifa said if the thief picked it up in the owner's domain or he carried it out, the act of hotzio, of taking it out, similar to the act of picking up. Just like picking it up, it comes into his own domain, even though physically speaking he's still within the confines of the owner's domain, but by picking it up more than 3 tfachim from the ground, it's coming into your own domain, into the thief's domain. And that's an act of thievery. Af hoitzah nami, so too the act of hotzah, you have to take it out, but the osi, the Rishusei, it comes into your own domain, not into a public thoroughfare. Because coming into a public thoroughfare would not be considered coming into your own domain. And hence, coming into a public thoroughfare does not acquire it. And certainly in our case, acquire in terms of thievery. Well, now that we demonstrated how each Amora infers from each part of the Tanaic source, what about the other part of the Tanaic source with regard to each Amora respectively? The Rav Acha kashya reisha, the Ravino kashya seifa. According to Rav Acha, the reisha will pose a problem for Rav Acha, because in the reisha we infer that once you take it out, wherever it is, even through Shisham, you are koneh. Rav Acha did not say that way. Ravina is presented with a problem from the Seifa, because we inferred from the Seifa that only when you carry it out into your own personal type domain are you going to acquire, but not into a public domain. The Gemara answers, Reisha l'Rav Acha lo kashya. The Reisha does not pose a problem for Rav Acha. Kama de lo osilu shusei, as long as you didn't bring it into your own domain, Rishus Bailim Karino Bay. It's considered on a legal level the owner's domain, which means that until that would mean that even if you bring it into a public domain, it's still not your own domain. So what status would the public domain have? It would have the status of the owner's domain with regard to acquisition, i.e. non-acquisition. Seifa l'Ravina lo kashya, the end of the source is not a problem for Ravina. Hoitzadum yadad ba lo amrinan, the assumption that the act of hoitzah has to be similar to the act of hagbah, in the sense that just like hagbah comes into your own domain, so to the act of hoitzah, Ravina doesn't see that equation. Hotzah, it's true, that comes immediately into your own domain, legally speaking, by picking it up. It's as if you're detaching it from the owner's domain and coming into your own domain. But with regard to Hotzah, not necessarily so. You don't have to be motzi it into your own domain in order to acquire. Even if you're motzi it, even if you drag it out into a public domain, you still will. You are going to acquire it. Before we conclude, let us point out that the upcoming Gemara represents a nosei, a topic that lasts for a very long time. We'll continue until Lamed Heyomid Beis, but in the course of our Mirza Shem, our upcoming Daf Yomi Shum, it's going to have to be punctuated by nature of the forum in which these shiurim are being recorded.